will be your moderator today. I am Patricia Miranda, the Global Director Advocacy of the Latin American Network for Economic and Social Justice, LatinDat. And this event is co-organized by LatinDat, AfroDat, APMDD, GBD USA, Eurodat, SHLUG Norway, Arab Watch Coalition, CEATIN Uganda, Action Aid, CID, and Christian Aid. We do have translation only by Zoom for the participants that are connected today. And we will have, well, thanks for being here. The co-organizers of this event most of us have been working on debt issues for more than 20 years. And today, what motivates us to organize this panel is the rising debt burdens in low and middle income countries. That is constraining our country's response to urgent people's needs in a context of multiple crises. Today, we want to raise awareness about the rapidly deteriorating sovereign debt situation and all the risks that this involves for global southern countries. We will hear today how the current instruments to deal with the debt resolution, are they working, maybe they are not working, to address the current and future debt challenges. We will discuss about proposals to help countries to avoid the debt trap and to deal with this overlapping crisis. We have in this panel today southern representatives from southern regions, and we want to emphasize and to strengthen the southern voices to hear from themselves what is the debt situation in their countries and in their regions. So the panel that I have, the great panel that I have here today, I'm going to introduce them. We have May Buenaventura. She is the team manager of the Debt Justice Program of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, APMDD. We have Maya Kolodenko. She is the former head of the International Affairs Unit of the Ministry of Economy of Argentina. We have, and both of them will join us virtually. We have here Jason Braganza. He's the Executive Director of the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, AfroDat. And we have Mark Flanagan, Deputy Director of the IMF's Strategy Policy and Review Department. Mark, welcome back to the CSPF. We will also have two participants, two people that will make specific comments on key issues that are needed to be on the table in this discussion. We will have Reverend Charles Shilupia. He is the Executive Director of the Jesuit Justice and Ecology Network Africa. And we will have Juan Pablo Bogoslavsky. He is a researcher at CONICET Argentina, and you might know him for being the former UN independent expert on foreign debt and human rights. So without further delay, I would like to ask Mark, what is your assessment about the current debt situation, in particular in the Global South? What are also the projections in terms of the debt risks? And will there be any improvements that will be implemented in the current debt restructuring processes? And how do you foresee a mechanism for, because we hear that in the next months or couple of years, there might be more countries that are currently in a severe debt problem and might get into debt defaults. How do you see a mechanism, and how do you see this could work out for these countries?
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you very much for inviting me today to this event. It's nice to be here, and welcome everyone to Washington. We're glad to see you here. Glad to have a chance to continue our dialogue with the debt network, the CSO debt network on debt issues. I thought I'd give a very short presentation to try to answer the questions Patricia posed, which are good, very good questions. So without further ado, let me move forward. So just on debt developments, I want to make 2 points, 2 high-level points here. One, by looking back over the last 40 years. I know there's concern we're in another debt crisis already. I'm going to say we're not. It's not a pre-HIPC style situation, but there are risks we'll get there. So if you look at the charts on the left, you can see debt has definitely trended up over the last decade. But in a 40-year perspective, we're not quite at the levels we were during the HIPC period. Moreover, arrears accumulation is also far less than it was during the HIPC period. Now, that isn't to say that some important things haven't changed. And those are the 2 pie charts on the right. What we've seen is a major shift in creditor structure in the last 30 years. We've seen a shift away from the Paris Club towards non-Paris Club creditors. And by the way, the way to read these pie charts is that the inner circle aggregates the outer circle. So you can see bilaterals is the sum of non-Paris Club and Paris Club, but you can see that the overall share of bilaterals has also fallen, and we've seen more commercial debt building up, particularly bondholders. And this has had major implications for the efficiency of restructurings. So that's a big development. So what are debt restructuring developments? Well, it's more like non-developments, right? Things have not been moving forward. There's some underlying successes, but they're very long timelines. You all know about Chad, Zambia. There have been long delays in forming official creditor committees, even longer delays in signing MOUs. And a number of these cases aren't even complete yet, right? And by the way, this goes beyond the common framework. It's also happening outside the common framework. In cases like Sri Lanka, where we had a long time between an agreement on an IMF program and a staff and financing assurances received from creditors. Same thing in Suriname. So this is not particular to the common framework. It goes back to this issue of the change in creditor structure. Now, the optimistic view about these developments. The optimistic view is that, well, we're integrating new creditors, official creditors, into the international architecture. And it was to be expected that they take some time to accommodate themselves to the processes, to learn about them, to set their own internal processes. And the international community is doing what it can to help with that, to help move that along quickly. And in the course of time, that will resolve itself and will restore the efficiency of restructuring processes. There are risks to this, though. Right? There are a number of risks. So top of my list is other countries that need a restructuring, observing how you enter into the process and don't seem to leave, may decide, you know what, I'm gonna try to delay and avoid it. And that's actually a terrible thing for countries that are in a debt crisis to do. So that's a big risk here. The other is creditors get used to not coordinating with each other and just habitually wait each other out. You know, and that can introduce delays into the process as well. I'm going to acknowledge that there are risks also there are tools and policies at the IMF. Of course, the IMF has an important role in restructurings. That our tools and policies may have some gaps that we have to address. And finally, I do want to point to the fact that while I said we're not in a pre-HIPC situation yet, we're not in a widespread sovereign debt crisis, the wrong realization of global risk could quickly push us into that situation. I think it's quite clear we're going to pick up 4 to 5 cases per year in the next couple of years. With the wrong realization of global risks, continued large supply shocks, you could see that number multiply considerably. And that's a WEO downside scenario that we have articulated. So that is a real risk that we're worried about and watching. Now, what's actually impeding the efficiency of restructuring if we want to drill down? Well, top of the list is underdeveloped creditor processes. The new creditors are the locus of the problem. They don't have internal processes for how to write down debt, and they haven't figured out how they want to coordinate multilaterally to do that. So that's an issue. We can, of course, at the fund, we can work with them to a point, but we do need assurances that they're going to do something so we can get stuck a little bit. We can also work with creditors, and here's a distinction I want to make that's important. Creditor processes are owned by creditors. They're not owned by the fund. So the fund can convene creditors like we've done in the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, which a few of you might have heard of. We can convene them to get them to talk about overcoming some of the problems with coordination in their internal processes, but we can't force them. It's up to them to make these changes. Second thing I want to highlight here, impeding the efficiency of restructurings, is our DSAs, something in our control, the fund's DSAs. These need acceptance from creditors and from, of course, domestic civil society to support efficient restructurings, but there are methodological and informational issues that are getting in the way of this. What do I mean by that? Well, we do have two frameworks. The one you'll probably most be familiar with is the LIC-DSF, Low Income Country Debt Sustainability Framework. And there are a number of questions and issues that have arisen about that over the years. And ordinarily, we have a methodological review of the LIC-DSF every 5 years. It's overdue right now. Unfortunately, it's not coming down the pike probably for another 3 years. So we're looking at ways to address some of the issues that come up. These are issues like, how do we judge what is the appropriate social contract to assess when we think about fiscal policy? Because countries have an implicit social contract about what kind of safety net is required, what kind of social support is required. And that's an area we need to look at in a little bit more detail. There are questions about information sharing of the DSAs. I know ordinarily we publish them when we have a program. Of course, if our programs get up because the restructurings are held up, we don't publish them. And that's a problem because the DSAs are meant to be read. They are meant to be cross-checked by people. There are features baked into them to encourage transparency and accountability by our staff. But if they don't get out there, that's a problem. So we have to do something about that. And the last thing I want to highlight is we've been looking at our policies. We've been getting stuck with an inability to move forward in some of these cases because creditors are stuck. And the question is there anything we can do with our policies to better incentivize movement by creditors? I think the answer to that is tentatively yes. So what are the priorities ahead? Against that backdrop, what do we think we need to do here at the fund? What is our view on the priorities? Well, not surprisingly, we think, we need to catalyze progress amongst official creditors. And that's our Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable. And we just need some consensus on some key technical issues that underpin the architecture, the role of MPBs, comparability of treatment, cutoff dates for new financing. All these were settled for the Paris Club, but they're not settled for new creditors, and they have to be part of the consensus as well. So we need a bigger table to get everybody agreed on some of these things. For the private sector, maybe I should anticipate the note at the bottom here. So let me skip directly to the note. I know many of you have been advocates of SDRM, Sovereign Debt Restructuring Mechanism, a formal bankruptcy procedure for countries like we have for every other class of debt. That has never intellectually died. However, politically it's dead, and it remains dead and out of reach. I think there's maybe some scope to tighten anti-vulture fund legislation in some circumstances. And the key is incremental progress with the current contractual framework for private creditors. That means getting CAC's collective action clauses in their enhanced form into bonded debt. That means getting new contractual features that are being promoted, like climate resilient debt clauses into debt to help protect countries from natural disaster. So there's things the private sector can do, but unfortunately, we're not there politically with an SDRM. For debtor countries, of course, there's a transparency issue. I think it's probably as frustrating to us as it is to you that in many cases, you don't know what the debt is in a country until there's a crisis. That's a problem. It's hard to avoid a crisis if you can't see the thing that's causing the crisis fully. So they have things to do to work on their domestic legal frameworks and systems. Finally, for the IMF, we are looking at new information and DSA sharing guidelines with the view to getting that information and the full DSA into the public domain earlier in the process and even before we go and approve a program. And I think we can do that probably by the end of the second quarter of this year. And we're also looking at adjusting our policies to facilitate engagement. So that's an overview for you of where the fund thinks we stand on debt issues, where we think the problems are, and what we're doing about them. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark, for those insights and for also those provocative messages. I would like now to invite our colleague May Buenaventura from APMDD. May, she's joining us by Zoom. Hello, May. Asia has countries with a heavy debt burden, and in some cases, the restructuring processes are not delivering for people. What is your assessment of the current debt system and how all these mechanisms are being implemented in Asia? What are the main calls that social movements have from Asia? Thank you, May.
Yeah, so good evening, everyone from the Philippines. I hope you can hear me well. And thank you for this opportunity, for this session that we're co-organizing with many other organizations. And thanks also to Mark for the idea shared earlier. So last March 10, if I'm not mistaken, we just passed the third year of COVID, since it was declared a pandemic. And while outwardly in the world, it seems like we're out of it, there's still millions of people in the South who remain gravely vulnerable, not only to ill health, but also to intensifying climate change, the lack of basic public services, food and fuel shortages that are growing more acute, to name a few. So we must mention that this includes women who are feared to number by 475 million in extreme poverty by 2030 from data from the UN Women. So it's of course been alarming to see external borrowings of low and middle income countries in East Asia, the Pacific, and South Asia breaking records at 1.23 trillion as of end 2020, or this translates to almost their entire export earnings for the year. In the same period, they paid 115 billion in debt service to international financial institutions and private lenders, or 98 billion more than in 2019. You have already seen how conditions are particularly dire in South Asia, where all countries were recently downgraded in their growth forecasts by IMF. So, talking with our colleagues on the ground, they've seen queues where people literally collapse while lining up for flour. And 6 months after the catastrophic flooding, which was, of course, made worse by global warming and glacial melt, there's still an estimated 10 million people who are without access to safe drinking water. But this year, they are expected to pay 22 billion in debt repayments. The negotiations for the delayed negotiations for a 1.1 billion loan tranche, which is part of the 6.5 billion bailout agreed in 2019, is dragging on, while foreign exchange reserves dwindle. Pakistanis will also be shelling out millions of dollars as IMF collects surcharges for high debt levels and failure to pay outstanding obligations on time from until I think 2030. Still, we've seen news reports of the Pakistani government prioritizing debt repayments despite this humanitarian catastrophe on the ground, and they're jumping from pillar to post to borrow some more. So another country in really deep trouble is Sri Lanka. We all know what happened to Sri Lanka, and recently its GDP was forecasted to contract by 4.3%. So they're facing a host of austerity conditionalities attached to debt structuring. There seems to be to have a calm settling over the country, but beneath it, we see millions of diminished lives inadequacy of food, and much reduced incomes. Inflation may have dropped from more than 90%, but it's still at a staggering 59%. Mm, And the 3 billion bailout package from the IMF may be just another window to more debt of about 4 billion from the World Bank, the ADB, and other lenders. In Southeast Asia, we also see Lao. Lao PDR, where guaranteed debt is projected to exceed 100% of GDP by the end of the year. This will be, of course, this is accompanied by a sharp depreciation of their national currency and rising inflation, which has risen swiftly from below 2% in 2021 to 37% in October 2022. These countries, no, Sri Lanka and Pakistan, Laos, they have they're facing these conditions, and Sri Lanka was in fact found by Debt Justice to have the highest external debt payments this year, amounting to 75% of government revenue, followed by 65.6% for Laos and more than 57% for Dominica and more than 46% for Pakistan. So these countries, Pakistan, Nepal, and Laos PDR, availed of the debt relief afforded by the DSSI, temporary and limited as it was. But obviously, this has been shown to be an inadequate measure, and we see this in how debt problems have systemically began many years before COVID and aggravated or accelerated during COVID. So after the DSSI ended in 2021, as we say, it just kicked the can down the road. Regular debt payments had to be made. The amounts suspended as they fall due in coming years will also be more significant. As per the G20 recommendations of rescheduling terms, this will grow bigger and bigger in the coming years. No? And in the meantime, they are also amassing more debt. Also, with a common framework, which seems to not be so common after all, it seems that we're fitting the problem to the solution rather than the other way around. And of course, it's a problem that debt treatments under the CF require an active IMF program, which carries a lot of unpopular austerity measures. So, for example, in Pakistan, there's really a lot of resistance to mention of the IMF. And meantime, we are also concerned that there's a lot of a finger pointing or playing the blame game, and particularly citing China as an obstacle. So, as Pakistan, Nepal, and Sri Lanka have shown, ignoring middle income countries in debt reduction efforts is also being proven wrong. And we take issue with the kind of debt sustainability frameworks that we have, as singling out MICs as relatively more able to meet their debt obligations, but many of those countries are in fact similar situated also with low income countries. And coming from decades of economic difficulties and debt accumulation, the MIC's deterioration was actually shown to be faster and with greater impact from the cascading and combined effects of interest rates, inflation, and skyrocketing commodity prices. This is just the result of what we're saying, that the debt sustainability analysis that puts a premium on meeting creditor claims and is divorced from context and actual development needs, human rights, gender equality, and climate commitments is problematic. So also, Mark also, I think, mentioned the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, and of course, we also are looking at the World Bank's evolution roadmap. And again, we're worried that are we again looking at the emperor's new clothes, because more debts and private sector investments are being pushed as supposedly bolder resolutions or responses to the defining crisis of our times, the crisis of development and climate change. Also, because these initiatives did not benefit from public scrutiny by other important stakeholders such as civil society, media, and borrowing countries, as would have been possible under a multilateral system such as the UN with more equitable and democratic participation spaces and where divergent views can be expressed. So, what we want is basically a reiteration of civil society calls and demands. And we're saying that in the context of multiple crises, in the context of a systemic crisis, systemic solutions or responses are also required. Uh, many of those responses are really too uncomfortably business as usual, and they may turn out again or are turning out again to be false. So, as part of global debt justice movements, we reiterate our demands for extensive and massive debt cancellation for all countries in need, including to both low and middle income countries, assessed with respect to their development financing requirements and provided by all creditors. Questionable or illegitimate debts must be immediately and unconditionally cancelled. And second, we need a debt architecture reform agenda for real change and real solutions. We stress once again our call on governments to establish a fair, transparent, binding, and multilateral framework for debt crisis resolution. In addition, we underscore calls for the immediate delivery of new, additional, and non debt creating climate finance for adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage, far beyond what was pledged as 100 billion per year by 2020, which is inadequate and has not been met in large part. As you know, we are one of the most climate threatened regions in the world, and the delivery of climate finance is an obligation under the UNFCCC, an obligation that the advanced economies are duty bound or treaty bound to fulfill. And second, there must also be a review from national to global of changes in lending, borrowing, and payment policies and practices that prevent the reaccumulation of unsustainable and illegitimate debts, strengthens democratic institutions and processes, and upholds human rights and people's self determination. There must also be genuine, participatory, and inclusive debt transparency and accountability mechanisms. And finally, we must also look at debt historically, and that against this backdrop, we will understand the call for reparations for the South, which has largely contributed the least to the climate crisis, and also to the way the economies have deepened their inequalities and their problems within the economy. So historically, we call for reparations for the damages caused to countries, peoples, and nature due to the contracting, use, and payment of unsustainable and illegitimate debts and the conditions imposed to guarantee their collection. So I will end there. Thank you.
Thanks, May, for that thorough analysis from Asia and for stating the key demands from CSOs. I would like now to give the floor to Jason Braganza. Jason, several countries in Africa are in a critical debt situation. Some of them are now under the common framework. What is your assessment to how extent this is fitting for purpose or not? And what are the main challenges for these countries, but also for others that are close to a debt default?
Patricia, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and good morning to everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where we all are today. Let me first of all begin with the point that Mark started off with in one of his charts about where the general debt picture tends to be today vis-a-vis pre-HIPC. And I think allow us to reflect a little bit, not just on the African continent, but more generally about why we need to go away from that very narrow view of things. And one of the lessons that, or some of the lessons we may have learned from the HIPC period. I think, first of all, that the debt crisis that we're facing today on the continent and the global south more generally is to do with structural issues at the global level, structural issues at the national level, and the idea that globalization was meant to be the silver bullet that was going to get low and low middle income countries out of the predicaments that they were in, all of which have not actually happened. Hence why we find ourselves in the predicament that we're in. I'll take the first one and each of them in turn. The structural issues at the global level is that it's very difficult for civil society organizations working on these issues to find ourselves having to be campaigning and advocating for for many of the solutions that had been part of the advocacy in the early 2000s, and yet the global system has not adjusted itself to have dealt with the evolution of creditors, evolution on the type of debt that is being provided to developing countries, particularly in Africa. And when I say the type of debt here, I refer particularly to how we've moved from the increasing non-concessional from concessional to increasingly non-concessional types of loans. We've seen, a lot of encouragement through the advice that many African governments have been receiving to explore capital markets through the form of issuance of sovereign bonds, Eurobonds. Part of the reason why some of the countries like Zambia, like Ghana, have ended up defaulting and having to apply for some sort of debt relief restructuring process under the G20 common framework, or the not so common framework, as May very eloquently has put it. And so at the global level, there are these structural issues that the African continent is having to grapple with. It's finding itself in a debt crisis. We call it a debt crisis because it is a debt crisis. I think we should not reduce ourselves to metrics and statistics when people's lives are at stake, when women and children are going hungry. I think May has just mentioned, instances where people are dying, waiting in line to just receive a bag of flour to cook. So I do think we should humanize this conversation very, very urgently. At the national level, the issue around debt is that, it's about the advice being given to take on debt, but also the sectoral investment of debt. And in Africa, I think, this has been a major challenge. A lot of the debt has been used to finance big mega infrastructure projects that have a significant lifespan in terms of not only in terms of repayment, but also in terms of revenue generation. So the return on the investment of debt in these projects have a very long period. And in the short to medium term, the cost is then passed on to citizens. And this creates a very vicious cycle in terms of having to fill the fiscal deficits that are associated with those projects. And then, in turn, very tight and regressive tax policies that are being proposed. And so I think looking, pre-HIPC and post-HIPC, these structural issues are things that have not been addressed in a systemic way. And therefore, we do find ourselves in some of these, in this predicament. Globalization has not worked for many African countries. Yes, we are integrated into the global economy, but the system, the architecture, the rules, and the governance frameworks through which Africa is supposed to interact in the global economic and political architecture have not changed to appreciate the increasing role that the African continent plays in this regard. And therefore, what we've seen is that globalization has led to an erosion of the power of the role of the state, the African state, and has been replaced with that of multinational corporations, private sector, and leveraging of private finance. And this we know actually does have a negative, broadly has tended to have a negative impact in terms of delivery of public services, but also on the fiscal side. A lot of the fiscal deficits that are being accrued or being experienced by African countries are as a result of not being able to generate their own tax revenues, but instead they're being subsidized by through, having to subsidize tax incentives, tax holidays that are provided to multinational corporations in order to attract investment. I think the second point around globalization is that they've also been shifting global priorities. And I think for Africa, this is particularly very difficult because every 5 years or every 10 years, there's a shift in global priorities, whether it is trade, whether it is climate, whether it is now it's climate finance, the energy transition, and so on. African governments are forced and faced with having to make policy trade-offs. And as a result of that, there is a fiscal effect or impact on the provision of public services. There is a fiscal impact on having to create space for leveraging finances to deal and meet some of these global priorities in order to attract external finance. And so when you think about the transformation agenda and the idea of globalization, a lot of this has not worked for the African continent. And to a large extent, the predicament we find ourselves in today is in part that sort of contributor. Of course, we can't look at debt in isolation. What are the drivers of debt? Illicit financial flows is a major contributor to fiscal deficit that many African countries are experiencing. And again, just to buttress the point of the global system not adjusting to these matters, only just recently, after several years of advocacy, we are now making some progress in trying to get global tax rules being defined and decided at within an institution where all countries have an equal voice, and this is the United Nations. So perhaps there is something for us to think about in that context. And I think the bottom line here in my first sort of submission is that debt-financed development or growth will not work for Africa. I think this is the experiment that has been tried for several years throughout the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s. It just will not work. The volatility that May has described is exactly the same type of volatility the African continent faces, whether it is weather-related, whether it is price-related, because we are predominantly a primary commodity exporting continent. Those price volatility affect revenue mobilization. It affects the ability to plan properly and plan taxes. The debt accumulation has predominantly been in foreign currency. And of course, every time these fluctuations in the economic situation and currency fluctuations take place, this affects the value of debt and therefore affects how debt servicing is done. The idea of profit maximization underpinning the idea of globalization is, of course, is a big problem, and that is sort of linked to some of the drivers of debt. So I did mention illicit financial flows as being one of them. There's the issue of illegitimate debt. I think that's a very important point that we are faced with on the continent. And in part, this is being driven by this idea of profit maximizing. How do wealthier countries or wealthier businesses continue to accumulate that wealth at the expense of African citizens? And so it is important for us to really think about Africa's role and the situation that it currently faces in a globalized world, whether there needs to be more voice and more activism in not just reforming. I think the crisis that we're facing right now begs us to go beyond using the word reform. I think there needs to be a slightly more radical description of what is needed in terms of coming from the continent. And what could this actually mean? I think, first of all, African governments and African civil society organizations need to move away from the IMF and World Bank mantra of short-term crisis management, because that's essentially what the advice to many of our governments and many of our ministries of finance is about. It's all about short-term planning, short-term crisis management. It's all about dealing with short-term balance of payments challenges, short-term liquidity issues, rather than thinking about the more structural and transformative agenda that our countries actually need and our continent actually needs. And what this does is that it favors, in the context of debt, it favors creditors, right? When you're readjusting your entire national budget just to make sure that your creditors or your debt is being serviced, you're completely overhauling your national development plan in favor of dealing with creditors and in favor of dealing with debt servicing. And this is what we're seeing. We saw this through the DSSI. We've seen this through the G20 Common Framework. We're seeing this through the IMF fiscal consolidation and austerity measures, that a lot of this is, whilst trying to, under the guise of trying to create fiscal space, really it's about making sure that the creditors, on the one hand, are actually very happy. I think the point that May raised on questionable and illegitimate debt is very, very important. And I think I would like us to also turn the tables around here. In a conversation I was in yesterday, and a couple of weeks ago, I asked the question, institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, credit rating agencies have access to incredible amount of data, have access to all sorts of modeling and scenario planning that, civil society and African governments could only dream about. I'm sure, somebody in the IMF here could predict how many steps to take for me to go from here to downstairs without me even leaving my seat right now. But it's quite unimaginable to think that they cannot predict that a country is going to have these problems in the future. It's quite unbelievable that credit rating agencies cannot see some of these issues happening, given the way African economies are structured. And so there needs to be some responsibility that is placed on lenders, on creditors across the board, whether it's bilateral, multilateral, commercial or private. And I think lastly, there is, in terms of, the negotiations that are currently going on, I think there's a really good opportunity for African civil society organizations and governments really to start calling for stronger demands for voice. I think in the UN system, we've seen how effective the African group has been in pushing forward this resolution on tax. I think when it comes to issues of debt and macroeconomic stability, there is an opportunity really for us to take on in what a new global debt architecture might look like. And I'll just pause there. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason, for those reflections from Africa and for those concrete proposals. I would like now to give the floor to Maya Kolodenko. Maya, Argentina has been through a deep and long process of debt restructuring, and many eyes and ears from people in this room have been over Argentina for a long time. So there are many lessons learned from that experience. In addition, you have made an analysis of the current core debt risks for southern regions. Maya and her team wrote a report that on Friday of this week will be available. It will be co-published by Afrodat and Latindat. So Maya, what are your main findings? And in your views, what are the key issues or key next steps towards a new debt architecture?
Thank you very much. Let me thank you for the invitation, and it's a pleasure for me to be here with such distinguished panelists and to discuss this important topic that gathered us today. I will start my intervention briefly to add some data and analysis on the work that we've done on the current diagnostic on the debt landscape, and then I will go to the lessons learned from Argentina's recent sovereign debt restructuring. Finally, I'll make some remarks on the issues on the debt reform agenda, and we'll add some insight on important things to consider. So on the current context, right, many speakers already mentioned that multiple shocks have affected the global economy. First with COVID, the war in Ukraine, of course, the war and the impacts of COVID, both on the war, brought about different reactions from countries, and in particular, the reaction from central banks to tame the impacts of the inflation that brought about by the halt in supply chains. And this result, right, of tightened financial conditions worldwide that feature both reduced liquidity and increase the financing cost is particularly harmful for development countries. In particular, as the IMF and the World Bank find, compared to pre-pandemic level, debt has augmented substantially. In particular, in low-income countries, right? In low-income countries, almost 60% of countries have reached debt distress territory or are at heightened risk of it, right? But this rising financing costs also affect the developing economies' capacity to provide basic services to the population, and also fight and be able to respond and make the necessary investment for development and the climate resilience and to attain the sustainable development goals, right? This tightening of financial conditions also could hamper our 2030 agenda. This was mentioned by other speakers, but I did also to highlight this. And as Mark also highlighted, the debt landscape, of course, the debt vulnerabilities and the debt burden has increased, but also the debt landscape and the structure of the debt and the creditor landscape has changed. The type of external debt has changed, and the type of creditors providing financing. We find, of course, as Mark finding in his chart, right, the rising non-Paris Club creditor, but also the non-bank private sector. It's the private sector who also rise in providing loans to countries recently, but the non-bank private sector has risen substantially. And this is what we find in our report. Also, this is different in different regions. It's different how this has impacted. For instance, the non-Paris Club debt, the non-Paris Club creditors, as a percentage of total external debt, is smaller maybe in Latin America and Asia than in Africa. In Africa, it's more substantial and has gained more weight. Since the global financial, we find that since the global financial crisis, the share of public and publicly guaranteed debt could complicate in the future restructurings. In the past, we've been having more official sector debt, and this as well, the history of the Paris Club and how countries could get together to restructure debt with official sector is quite different to get together and try to restructure debt with the private sector. And I will tell more about that in the next part of my intervention. But this also brings, as I said, more uncertainty and vulnerabilities in future and potential restructurings. This increased dependency on international capital and the legal, in particular, right, the legal regimes of global financial centers. Briefly on lessons learned from Argentina. Argentina in 2019 was facing a dire economic situation. Our foreign exchange dominated public debt, as when the government took office in 2019, was unaffordable, unfinanceable, and unsustainable. From December 2019 to August 2020, Argentina engaged in debt workouts and seek to restructure approximately, it was 64.8 billion in debt regulated by foreign legislations. These negotiations started and the government began as soon as as the new administration took office and ended by the mid 2020. The government restructured the debt with bondholder. I will tell more about our unique sequencing, because Argentina, when the government took office, also we have to restructure debt with private sector, as I mentioned, that was unfinanceable, unaffordable, and unsustainable. But Argentina also had a significant debt with the IMF, and also had to restructure debt with the Paris Club. So Argentina began negotiations with private bondholders, and after the negotiation, we were successful, and we were able to restructure 99% of eligible international bonds. Then Argentina, well, in our second thing we started with, this was unique because, and the bondholders also were reluctant to our proposed sequencing. Usually, the bondholders and creditors ask for you to have an IMF program when you start a negotiation, but when we looked at our payment schedules and our need for refinancing, we definitely needed to start with the private bondholders with this kind of debt first, and then with the IMF. So we started with that, and then as soon as we were able to, we also started our renegotiation for a new IMF program, because, well, we have the IMF itself was a big bulk of Argentina's debt at the moment, with a program of $45 billion. And then, after all, was the restructuring with the Paris Club. Argentina had this unique sequencing, and then we have some guidelines that guided our negotiations. As I said, and this is very important, right? We have set these guidelines, we publish our guidelines for the negotiation, we publish and work with our National Congress and with different stakeholders, internal and external, on some principles. Argentina published principles for debt sustainability, and we find that the ownership and the government on the driver's seat was of essence, and we have ownership of the negotiation, the entire negotiation of our debt restructuring. We knew and we secured that all relevant stakeholders were included. National Congress, the unions, the civil society, experts, academics, legal expert advisors, both at the international level and at the local level. Also at the international level, we have legal advisors, we have different kind of experts contributing to our negotiation in different ways. And then an important part of our process was to build a common sense around our negotiations. Building a domestic and international common sense was also very important. So Argentina, one thing that was as well particular with our negotiation is that we produced our own DSA, our debt sustainability analysis, and also we, during our negotiation with the private bondholders, requested the IMF and IMF DSA, right? Argentina, as a member of the institution, requested a DSA outside the parameters of the renegotiation, because we didn't start with the IMF negotiation at that time, and requested the IMF to produce our DSA. And this, for us, was really important also for the But well, we in our experience know that the IMF DSA plays a very important role when countries attempt to restructure debt. And in our case, we think it played a positive role. And I don't know if this experience can be generalized in that way, but this is an important part of the debt restructuring process that we need to take into account. And finally, on the debt architecture, and then under this current non-system for debt restructuring, we don't have a system in international framework. And of course, it's politically complicated today, but this, we have to say that this also could lead to countries to head to too little today debt restructuring. So we need to find some grounds and ways and avenues to discuss this and to keep reforming the international financial architecture for debt restructurings and to make it more efficient, to level the playing field. We know that this is still asymmetrical. Debtors and countries, we don't have the same information. We don't have, as debtor countries sometimes, there are, well, several asymmetries, and these asymmetries also entail power asymmetries. Power is, of course, money, but also is information. Creditors know more about the debtor. Also, transparency, of course, is very important, but transparency has to be both ways, debtor and creditor. We need to ensure and to work more to ensure more creditor transparency, all creditors and all stakeholders. Sometimes in a restructuring, you don't know exactly the interest or the incentives of private creditors, if they are hedged again or they have CDS for your, that will entail you to pay more if you're heading to default. So it's hard to know for a country which are the creditor holdings. So we need to work more on transparency. Some important issues also to work and to advocate for that we learn and we conclude in our report is that it's important to keep working on leveling the playing field. It's important for the global South, of course, to get together. I agree with what Jason recently said about raising more our voice, to be able to raise more our voice also in the government structure of different institutions, and to coordinate more. Sometimes it's difficult and that's hard to do. But well, work on DSAs to disseminate and tell countries how to produce DSAs and what's the value of the IMF DSA, and make them more transparent, of course. Sound sustainability analysis methodologies would be a great value added. Of course, we should work on ways to provide more liquidity to developing economies today. Work on ways to for instance, work on SDRs and how we can ensure a best channeling of the SDRs and ensure countries could attain the social development goals and the 2030 agenda. I mentioned the transparency and how we can work also with the international community. The common framework was a good step in the right direction for some kind of debt. But of course, it's still insufficient. We need to do more. The landscape of debt has changed. There are new creditor landscape, but also there's different kind of debt that we need to work on and ensure that we can level the playing field a little bit more and make restructurings and the debt architecture as a whole more efficient, more just, and yes, and to work for also for development. So I think more needs to be done, but we are heading in the right direction if we still work together.
Thank you, Maya, Thanks, Maya. And I think that there are several lessons, not only from Hippikas has been mentioned from Mark and Jason, but also from Argentina's example. And by taking all those lessons, probably the common framework wouldn't be as it is now, or probably the DSA would have further changes. So I think it's important to get those lessons learned from these experiences. I would like to ask if we have Reverend Charles in the room. Thank you. Well, I would invite you to make a brief comment of 4 minutes from your analysis and perspective from a faith and ecology approach. You may come in here, please, and use the podium.
A very good morning to you all. So my name is Father Charles Chilufya. I'm coming from Nairobi, and I work for the Jesuit Justice and Ecology Network Africa. So my role is in the field of economic justice and the protection of the planet. I'd like to sort of speak to the age-old call that has been raised in regard to the need for deeper reform. That's what we are facing, because this is happening not for the first time. And as Pope Francis sort of helps us, throws light on issues like this, he keeps informing us that we tend to look, as Jason was mentioning, at short-term solutions. And we're looking at the problem of debt as a crisis on its own. It's a crisis, but it's just a manifestation of other deeper problems. So it's a crisis that is related to other multiple crises reinforcing each other. And that's where we should go. That's where institutions like the IMF, civil society, governments should go. Why is this happening? And there are several issues that were raised. But coming from Africa, and with ramifications for Latin America as well, I'd like to point to the need to reform or to rethink the role of business in the economy. Yeah, and Jason aptly pointed to how business is modeled for profit maximization. And that's why the so-called trickle down has not worked for Africa for the last 30 years of neoliberalization, what we call in our space 30 years of nothing. Yeah, governments don't make money. Churches don't make money. Civil society don't make money. Who makes money? It's businesses. So how businesses are deployed and they are managed in an economy will determine by quite a bit whether country X or country Y will have resources from revenue collection, will have resources through jobs and other taxes, will determine whether this flow of finance. Yeah, as you know, we need to build at least 3 important forms of capital: infrastructure, social capital in health and education, as well as business capital. But it's business capital that will help us or make us pay for the capital that we need in social capital building, as well as infrastructure. So this is where I would like to point to. And at the moment, Africa, once again, is experienced an inflow of investment to extract the so-called technology minerals. As long as we don't reform the way the value chain, the global value chain is managed, we don't reform taxation, regulation, both within the countries and that global level, and I'd like to stress the global level, we will be back here. We'll be back here talking about the same thing. So I'd like to really reiterate that call for deeper reform, the reform of the international financial architecture, but like I said, with a stress on reform of investment, on how businesses work, and recapture business, rethink business as having a role to profit, to gain profits for its shareholders, as well as to earn something for stakeholders, as well as for poverty eradication. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Reverend Charles. And now I would like to invite Pablo Bohoslavsky, who is joining us by Zoom, and in such an unequal world and having inequalities in southern regions, debt and gender is an issue that it's not always mentioned, and it's important to have it into this discussion. Juan Pablo, please, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Good, great. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion. I appreciate this forum of exchange between financial institutions and civil society. I have two questions to Mark Flanagan, the colleague from the IMF. As the consideration of women's rights has been earning consideration within the IMF, a consideration that has been materialized to some extent through the gender strategy. I would like to pose two questions. First question is why gender equality is still not considered when undertaking the essay, so that it cannot be stated that debt is sustainable if governments are not able to fulfill at the same time both external debt contractual promises and human rights obligations towards women. In other words, shouldn't the IMF consider gender inequality when evaluating whether sovereign debt needs debt relief or not? This was the first question. And the second question is why the IMF does not undertake gender impact assessment to better design debt profiling and economic reform packages with debtor countries, or why these assessments are not publicly known. Many thanks.
Thanks, Juan Pablo. And I will take advantage to ask a couple of questions from the floor, and if there is any question by Zoom, and I will ask the IMF for help on that. So so we can take advantage of having these final answers today. So I have one question here, 2, 3, 4. Let's remain it as that, please.
Thanks, Patricia. Elaine Zuckerman of Gender Action. Well, I can't resist starting by thanking Pablo for raising gender issues, which I won't do, but just say that many of us, I think Patricia among them, Gender Action and many other groups, sent a very highly critical letter about the IMF gender strategy. I believe Amelia Ray sent it on our behalf. And you know, it's totally inadequate. But my question is completely different. May mentioned in passing China's role in debt, but it hasn't been discussed in the big picture today. And my question is to our Southern speakers to talk about the role of China's debt in the mix, its impacts in your countries, because we really haven't heard that. And the Western media has given this issue of China's debt an extremely critical view and said it doesn't accord with the IMF, et cetera. But what is the view from the South on China's debt in your countries? Thanks.
Thank you. Barry?
Thank you. Barry Herman, SocDev Justice. This is, I guess, addressed to Mark Flanagan. Your presentation is extremely distressing because there's a debt crisis for the debtors, but there's no crisis for the creditors. And it would seem that in the global forum, you know, you're asking the private sector to think systematically and institutionally and so on. But when they go home and put on a different hat, you know, they're managing other people's money and they don't want to take any losses. And as we saw in Chad, if you wait long enough, you don't have to. So it would seem that and as you said, there is no crisis yet. We don't see a systemic crisis yet. So it would seem that why would a politician in a creditor country want to address the systemic issue and take on the financial sector when she or he doesn't have to? But in any case, shouldn't we be planning for what to do when it does become a crisis for the creditors? Thank you.
Jill Gay, What Works Association. My question is for Mark Stanley. How has listening to the speakers today, how will that impact any changes of the IMF? Over and out.
Thank you. Yes, please. Thank you so much, Patricia. One, to Mr. Flanagan, the first speaker, regarding the issue of a crisis. When does a crisis become a crisis? In my country, Uganda, debt service almost takes 40% of our government income, and at the expense of provision of social services. So when are we going to reach a crisis if that is not a crisis? Two, the issue of what Jason, you raised, the drivers of debt, and the fact that debt is a symptom of a system, an economic system which has gone totally wrong. You know, so that means that instead of, like the Reverend pointed out, instead of looking at debt structurally, we are going back to the hip era, and that challenge will continue, you know. So we need to look at the causes of debt. And in Africa, the cause of debt is the issue which Jason raised, the way we are integrated in the global economy, you know, as exporters of raw material, import of finished product, and that extractive nature of the economy, that all the value goes out. So the ends are not meeting. That's why we are borrowing, yet we can't generate enough resources to be able to repay the loan. So we need to break that vicious cycle. And the cycle has to be broken when we look at the trade reforms and the economic policy and the way we are integrated into the global economy.
Thanks so much. And Matthew?
Thank you. A question really to Mark. First of all, I just agree totally with your assessment of the common framework as not achieving very much, to be polite about it. There's a lot more we could do, and I'll come back to that in a second. But I really disagree with you about the scale of the crisis. From the point of view of the degree to which debt service is currently crowding out spending on the SDGs, this is a much, much worse and more widespread crisis than HIPC ever was. I've talked about that last October in a seminar we had, and we've just produced a 2023 database updating that, which we'll be putting online very soon if anybody wants to see it, which looks at debt service compared to health, education, social protection, and climate spending, and finds that in more than 40 developing countries are spending more on debt service than they are on all of those four good types of spending combined. So I think we really need to be aware that what the debt crisis is currently doing is killing the SDGs. And maybe that's not the way the fund wants to look at it, but it would be nice if the fund could move towards looking at it over the next few years as part of the LIC DSF review. My question to you, Mark, was I remember on a panel, I think it was 5 years ago, but maybe 4 years ago, you said that you thought what was lacking was political will, and it might take us 10 to 15 years to get to the stage as it did between the Latin American debt crisis and HIPC, where we got to serious action. Are you any more optimistic now? Because while I see a lot of political commitment from Kristalina Georgieva and Mia Motley, I don't see it from the G20 or the G7. Are you any more optimistic than you were 5 years ago about the speed with which we could get to really comprehensive debt relief for a wide range of countries?
Thanks, Matthew. And I'm told that we have a question from David Archer by Zoom. David, are you ready?
Yes, if you can hear me, I'm ready. I just wanted to make this connection with the climate crisis. We've just recently analyzed at Action Aid the top third most climate vulnerable countries and find that 93% of them are at a significant risk of a debt crisis or in debt distress or debt crisis. Is there not a case for debt cancellation or urgent debt resolution for all of the most climate vulnerable countries, given that the debt crisis is actually acting as an accelerator of the climate crisis? That is, that countries who are in debt, having to earn foreign currency, end up having to shape their economies based on extraction of fossil fuels, natural resources, industrial agriculture like soybeans and palm oil, which themselves accelerate the climate crisis. And countries can't invest in more sustainable alternatives if they're under pressure of external debt. And just to the point that was raised now, I think any country, the other piece we found in this research was that any country spending over 12% of the national budget on debt servicing was squeezing out spending on public services, including health and education. And so there should be a recognition of that as an indicator of a crisis.
Thanks, David. I will receive two brief questions if we really want to get responses from Mark. Yes, please.
Thank you. Mine is just one line. This is to you, Mr. Flanagan. A question to you is, how do you intend to take into consideration the civil society perspective that there's a debt crisis while at your level you feel that it's not there? I'm just very curious on how do you take into these demands and their needs and what they're hearing from the ground?
Please.
Yes, Mr. Gadi for Suriname. Just short a contradiction, attracting investors by different tax holiday and tax exemption, but all multinationals for every investment plan, they were asking for tax exemption. How will the multilateral institution deal with this? Because tax exemption is for the national investors, but how to deal with the multinationals?
Thank you. Well, I will give the floor to our panelists in the same order. And Mark, most of the questions are addressed to you, and I will encourage also to make a comment about debt and gender. Mark, please.
Okay, thanks for the questions. So let me cover a few things here. Somebody, I think it was Barry, was it you who made the point? Or maybe it was Pablo. It was Pablo who made the point that, sustainability, there's an interesting feature to debt sustainability assessments, that there's an implicit sort of hidden assessment in the background, because public debt cannot be sustainable if other balance sheets in the economy are unsustainable. So, and that's most well understood when it comes to the financial sector, but it's less well understood by a lot of people when it comes to the household sector. So, we wouldn't think about if you don't have a sustainable household sector in some sense, you're not going to have a sustainable public debt level. And the issue is trying to get at this and analyze it in a meaningful way. At the moment in our DSAs, we look at high level concepts like how big is the fiscal adjustment required? What's the fiscal multiplier? And these are very inexact and imprecise ways to think about these issues. And, when I was saying during my presentation that we need a better way to do this, to take in account of the implicit social contract, this is what I was getting at. We're missing a tool in the DSA to make sure that when we do the public debt sustainability analysis, we're not missing that there's something terribly wrong in the household sector. And that could be because the social safety net is not delivering what it needs to. That could be because important SDGs are not being met. That could be because climate investments are insufficient. It could be because there's a problem with the gender strategy in a country. In gender inclusion, certainly gender inclusion is an important aspect of economy's developments. So, there is a way to think about these issues, even within such a technical instrument as a DSA. It's not there right now. It's one of the features we need to think about more in the context of the next DSF review, or if we do interim guidance in that context. Climate crisis, just briefly, there is a CSPF panel on this on Friday, where I will speak on this issue. So if you really want a long answer, you can come to that. And I will talk about, how climate and debt interrelate, interact, and I will talk about some problems and deficiencies in our DSF frameworks when it comes to analyzing climate and debt that we need to rectify right now. They are there, but there's no question climate factors can accelerate debt problems, and we need to properly capture that, warn about that, draw attention to it, and try to find solutions on behalf of the international community. Now, scale of the crisis. First, there are a number of countries in debt crises, and debt crises are a terrible, terrible thing for all countries who fall into them. They are something to be avoided. That's a principal part of our DSA framework, to try to help people see problems ahead of time and avoid them. I think, and I'm going to go into political economy here, I actually think we're not bad at predicting debt problems. But there is a terrible, terrible political economy out there when it comes to actually getting the international community to recognize debt problems. I wrote down a list for Madame Lagarde of countries I thought would go into restructurings in the next 5 years before she left. We were 95% accurate on that list. 95%. Of course, the list wasn't shared with anybody, but we were very good at it. But there's a difference between, technically predicting these things and convincing everybody in the system that there's a problem and pushing through the too little too late issues that arise, because there are powerful political economy forces aligned against debt restructurings. That includes within countries' governments. It includes the reasons why ministers of finance don't want to do restructurings. And yes, I've dealt with many ministers of finance who are the last holdout in doing a debt restructuring. One reason being that pretty much their job's on the line, right? So, you have a difference between what's good for them and what's good for the country. But, the financial sector will lobby like mad with the governments and with big creditor jurisdictions to try to prevent a restructuring. Official creditors will lobby like mad and will say, we'll give you new money. Just, take this new money. You're not going to get this new money if you restructure. They'll hold out carrots, they'll raise sticks. There's a huge political economy against restructuring. I haven't gone into it here, but if you've seen enough of these cases like I have, you know it's to overcome. So that also has a bearing on how easy it is to actually solve some of these underlying problems. I think, Matthew, you raised what I said 5 years ago, and it's interesting. I do think I am a little bit more optimistic. There's a little bit more energy in the system. What I'm not optimistic about is two things. I think there is some distance to an SDRM. I don't see the political will to do that right now. And look, as you know, the IMF has nothing against an SDRM. I mean, we proposed one 20 years ago, but the political will is not there to do it. I've long said that in that environment, you need to deconstruct debt restructuring process, and you need to make little progress with the elements of it, so that you get closer and closer de facto in the way the system operates to an SDRM, so that when the political will is there, it's not such a big step, if you follow. So some of the useful developments over time, I think, have been things like anti-vulture fund legislation that have arisen in some jurisdictions. There's a bill under consideration in New York right now. I don't give it much of a chance, but there has been an effort, and it's been successful, at least in the UK and Belgium, to put in place such legislation. That's an element that's getting into legal features that help with cram down of creditors, right? So you can make incremental progress on a lot of issues, in the meantime, until the politics is in place. I think where there is a lot of energy right now is to try to fix the official creditor coordination problems. I think there's a lot of energy right now in trying to fit contingent features into debt contracts that would make it easier to restructure things like climate resilient debt clauses. And there's also consideration of other specific features that come up in the context of restructurings like step downs and other value recovery instruments that are often applied, and how to better design them. So there's some energy in these spaces to do things. And I think you're going to see some results there. I think there's some, I think we can fix some of our policies. I say that with hesitation because right now I only see a very, very narrow path to some reforms that would make it easier for us to engage and avoid getting stuck. So the politics is better, and it reflects the difficulties of the last few years. But it's I'm sorry to say, Matthew, it's not in the place you want it to be, but it's better than it was 5 years ago. So just in terms of there were a couple of people who said, look, how when you're sitting here, Mark, and listening to this, take this into account. Well, you know, what do you take from these sort of discussions? Well, the one thing I always take is the need to make our DSAs more available at an earlier stage so that people can see them. One of the things we have recognized over the last decade in our DSAs is that one of the best ways to make them better is through transparency and accountability from everybody. And we baked in some features to try to make our staff reveal some of the assumptions that they use in DSAs. And that wasn't popular with our staff, by the way. It was not popular. But it doesn't work if we don't get the DSAs out there in the public early enough. So one thing we are focusing on is trying to overcome that problem and find ways to get that information published sooner so that people can react to it, so that it can generate a public debate, and so that people can actually come back to us and say, by the way, you've missed something important, because we do miss things. I'll be quite honest with you, we do miss things in some cases. So that's, I always take that away from these conversations, that people need information, they want it, and we have a responsibility to deliver it. Other issues, the issue of whether we have a crisis right now. Well, of course, the point I made was that we're not in the same situation as we were pre-HIPC. It's not that bad yet. Of course, that was really bad, right? It's not to say that there aren't problems, but we're not in a HIPC-style systemic crisis where we have a number of countries defaulted on their debt and in arrears. I do think, I'll go back to the risks. I mean, we're worried about this, right? An extended period of high real interest rates and low global growth would be a problem for a lot of countries. And you would move from 4 to 5 a year to a multiple of that going into debt crises. And that's not an outrageous alternative scenario to our WEO baseline, right? All it takes is a few further supply shocks to realize that kind of scenario. So I don't think we're in a systemic debt crisis in the sense of HIPC, pre-HIPC, where we had a lot of countries defaulting. I would say that we're closer than is comfortable, definitely. And I would also recognize your point, Matthew, that even though we're not in let me choose my words carefully here, a debt default crisis, it doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of pressures from debt service right now in the system that are affecting a lot of countries and their ability to invest, their ability to support their social safety nets, et cetera. But for that, I circle back to the point I made. There is a missing element of our analysis here that I think we need to fix in our next methodological round to help us do that analysis a little bit better. I'll stop here. I know the other panelists no doubt want to say a few words. if you have other bilateral questions for me, I'll stay a few minutes afterwards. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. May, if you want to answer about China and your final remarks.
Yes. China. There have indeed been China loans that are problematic, and we can cite several examples in Sri Lanka, where there are highly questionable debt-funded projects, and we're looking at issues of transparency and havoc on the environment and local communities. But at the same time, we find it problematic that such a spotlight is focused on China, but we're not looking at how much China really lends. So, for example, in the global regions like Africa and South Asia, more debt is held by multilaterals and private creditors, and these are also the very same entities that are not or did not participate in debt relief and have been actually let off the hook. So if debt relief efforts are to be successful, all lenders must participate and come to the table. If we just want to see that in the same way that China is being interrogated or blamed for as an obstacle, we must also look at multilaterals and the private sector, to which many global regions are heavily exposed. Yeah, so that's my response to the question. Thank you.
Thanks, May. Jason?
Thank you very much. I think I'll pick up the question around attracting investors and tax incentives. I think this is a very difficult position for many African countries and economies to be put in. But I think one important thing, at least from the African context that we've learned, and this is work that has been done by our partner organization, Tax Justice Network Africa, is that actually the tax incentives don't work in the sense of generating revenues that can then be reinvested in the economy. In fact, what they do is create further opportunities for multinational corporations to create very elaborate corporate structures to maximize the incentive out of and the revenue that's generated from those investments outside. The second point is also with regard to the connectivity of whatever foreign direct investment project might do to the rest of the economy. There's always in many instances, we've seen very few linkages between these types of investments with the rest of the real economy at the domestic level, and therefore you provide tax incentives, and then the investment comes in, but it's tends to be also dominated for export markets or for a particular segment of the economy. And so those linkages there in terms of domestic production contributing to those projects tends to be very problematic. So, and then the challenge there being is to have better cost benefit analysis of the pros and cons of tax incentives. Again, linking it backwards then also to the budget in terms of what it costs the taxpayer and the citizen to finance these tax incentives and tax expenditures, because ultimately that's how the system comes back, as James was mentioned, because then at some point we'll have our friends at the IMF visiting the Ministry of Finance saying, well, you need to then expand your VAT because we need to provide more tax incentives. So I think there's something there that needs to be talked about. I think lastly, I'll just say one thing about us not narrowing down this conversation to just issues of particular creditors. I think all creditors have a responsibility, whether they are historic or new entrants into the creditor market, particularly in the context of Africa. I think there is a very explicit political conversation trying to apportion a lot of the responsibility on newer creditors while trying to appease historical creditors and historical ways of doing lending in Africa. A lot of the human rights issues, transparency and accountability issues, environmental issues. These are same practices that were being done by loans and credit that was being provided in the 80s and the 90s to developing countries. And as I said, the fact that we've not been able to learn from those experiences and now are using those same indicators to try and politicize this question instead of looking at the human dimension of these impacts is something that we should really pay a lot more closer attention to. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. And Maya?
Yes, thank you. Well, briefly about the Chinese debt, we find that, and as I said in my intervention, that the weight of China's debt is different in regions. For instance, in Latin America, Chinese debt as percentage of total external debt is small. It's not so significant that it is in Africa. So this is an important part of the that this is important and we should take this into consideration. Sometimes the challenge with the Chinese debt is to determine whether it's official or private because of the SOEs that participate in this. In particular, in the case of Argentina, Chinese loans are mainly in the form of project finance and project preparations. I know that in other regions, these kind of projects and these kind of loans including collateralized. There are debt that include collateralized terms. It's not in the case of Argentina. So these are very much linked to projects, to very big projects and infrastructure in the case of Argentina. So this is also very important to know because this is also linked to development and to, finance a part of very important infrastructure for development for the country. So this is mainly about China, and overall, I think this debate was very enlightening, very much enriching for us and timely because even though we don't have the systematic crisis, maybe vulnerabilities are growing and we need to do more. And also we are looking forward to this roundtable of the IMF and the G20, if it's going to lead to something new, what are going to be its outcomes. So far, there have been 2 meetings and we don't know much about its results. So it's important that we keep discussing these issues and achieve desired outcomes.
Thank you. Thanks, Maya, and thanks, everyone. There are many challenges on the table, many proposals, claims from civil society organizations to the IMF around debt. So let's keep discussing, talking, and pushing for a transformation of the debt architecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you.